We all know GoPro has a tumultuous past, but now that DJI has left the door wide open in the US with the ongoing FCC ban, will this Hail Mary from GoPro actually live up to the hype? To find out, I'm going to do my best to make this GoPro not look like a GoPro, to see if this camera is something you should consider both as a consumer or professional. So, as a disclaimer, GoPro didn't send me any of this crap I'm about to talk about. I purchased all this shit because, first and foremost, I believed in the product, and also I wanted to build my own little action camera kit, whether for personal or professional use. So, as we dive into this video, we first need to ask ourselves, are action cameras even relevant in 2026? People have been trying to capture first-person perspectives dating all the way back to the 1960s, but we now live in an age where everyone is a content creator, and to be honest, it's become an increasingly valuable skill to market yourself as a creative professional. We have pocket gimbals, 360 cameras, and even little action cameras the size of your thumb. My first GoPro was a Hero 3 Silver back in 2012, and I've always loved the novelty of a little small camera that I could take anywhere. And for a while, our limiting factor was the form factor itself. These were tiny little cameras with tiny little sensors with nothing but a fisheye lens. So that unequivocally became the signature GoPro look. But this new Mission 1 has a 1-inch sensor. Generally, larger sensors lead to objectively better image quality. You get greater dynamic range, lower noise, and usually higher resolution for flexibility in post. So I was thrilled when GoPro announced the new Mission 1 series because their show reel finally looked like it was captured off of a high-end cinema camera, not a traditional GoPro. So it got me thinking, what is it about this new GoPro that makes it not look like a GoPro? It's a loaded question because there are a lot of variables that quantify image quality. So to examine that, I need to start with the first thing I always test with any new camera to give me a sense of where it performs and where it doesn't. I'm talking about latitude testing, which isn't necessarily measuring total dynamic range, but rather how forgiving the image is before it starts falling apart in post. It was traditionally used to test how much you can push and pull any given film stock and to see how it responds to different exposure indexes. And it's one of the first things I test because the higher the latitude, the easier it is to manipulate the footage in post. Older action cameras only really included a flat color profile, which baked in most of the color information. So you had really minimal latitude, so you couldn't really push creative looks. Looking at these quick tests, you can underexpose about 2 stops before the shadows start clipping and introducing that really ugly magenta noise pattern, and it's no surprise that your shadows are pretty much cooked at 5 stops over. Going the other way, we start losing our talent's cheek at about 3 stops over, with most of the skin tone being lost at +4. GoPro released their own LUT for the Mission 1, but it's not very good in my opinion. It tends to clip the blue channel, specifically when looking at the edges of fine details like trees, and everything has this really weird halo effect. Since Resolve 21 doesn't currently include a specific color space transform, I'm using a DCTL that converts GP-Log2 to DaVinci Wide Gamut, and then from there just outputting to S-Log3, but you can go to whatever you like, such as log C or whatever floats your boat. When we look at ISO performance, the Mission 1 holds up pretty well. I would comfortably use 1600, which is something I would typically never do with action cameras, and even 3200 looks pretty decent if you're in a pinch and you know you're going to crush the shadows. Things start to get a little muddy past 1600, but it's good to know that such a small sensor performs this well. But even poor ISO performance doesn't compare to this next dead giveaway of GoPro footage.
Yeah, we're about to shut it down. You know what it's all about. Turn it up loud. We're about to shut it down. All gas, no brakes. When we gon' step up in the place, we're about to shut it down. All gas, no brakes. When we gon' step up in the place, we're about to shut it down.
I feel like a lot of people have become obsessed with stabilization over the years, so much so that a lot of people just default to using gimbals, but sometimes you do want that frenetic and imperfect look, and a lot of that energy is just lost when you throw a camera on a stabilizer. And that especially holds true when you're hard mounting a GoPro to surfaces. When you're hard mounting a GoPro and have hypersmooth turned on, it gives everything this unnecessary floaty look because it's trying to stabilize something that doesn't need to be stabilized. If you have a locked point of reference within the frame and in your foreground, you usually don't need stabilization. That's where these come into play. They're ND filters, and in my opinion, they're a must-have accessory for the Mission 1 so that you're able to control exposure. For me, the lack of motion blur is a huge dead giveaway for action camera footage. It gives everything a consumer look because it's exactly what your iPhone does. It defaults to a super high shutter so that the electronic stabilization doesn't look blurry. The obvious answer would be to lock your shutter and use an ND, but with this camera, it's not so simple. See, Hypersmooth is sort of counting on you to use a high enough shutter to eliminate motion blur. So when you add it back in, you get this really weird smeary effect. So you have to be really picky when using Hypersmooth instead of just leaving it on all the time. My general rule of thumb is that if I'm hard mounting the camera or using any external stabilization, I'll lock the shutter and use NDs and turn Hypersmooth off. But when I'm in situations where I do want to use Hypersmooth, I'll set the shutter back to auto and add the motion blur back in post. But results may vary since you're relying on a software solution. Resolve 21 added a great new metal option for Mac that reminds me of the real smart motion blur days, but it is pretty processor intensive and will add a ton of render time. Speaking of motion, the Mission 1 Pro can shoot 8K 60, 4K 240, 1440 480, and 1080 960, which honestly is kind of wild for an action camera. If you're doing any kind of water sports or anything with liquid, the 1440p option kind of slaps because it gives everything that otherworldly effect and the footage just becomes mesmerizing to watch. The AK60 holds an incredible amount of detail while still having a good sense of slow motion, but I found myself using the 4K 240 setting the most since it strikes a great balance of quality and resolution with a beautiful 10x slow motion. I would probably top out at 1440p for select moments because it looks like the bitrate has a tough time keeping up once you introduce a lot of small details in your scene. I haven't really messed with the 1080 960 option, to be honest, because it looks a little muddy in my opinion, but it is a cool option that it's there. GoPros have always had a super wide field of view because they were designed as POV cameras. There's usually 3 different in-camera crops to choose from: linear, wide, and super view, and most often people will just use the default settings out of the box, which is also a really big characteristic of why GoPros look like GoPros. Now, if you're doing any first-person POV, I would recommend using wide or super view, which makes the barrel distortion a lot more prominent, which also lends itself to that first-person perspective. But if you're trying to get away from that typical action cam look, I recommend using linear since it corrects a lot of that distortion in camera, and it looks a lot more like a generic ultra-wide angle rather than a fisheye GoPro. Implementing these cameras has always been tricky because your only option has been the super wide angle, but that's what the upcoming ILS version aims to solve. But keep in mind that your crop factor is going to be pretty tight with the 1-inch sensor. But that also leads me to my next big problem that these cameras have, and that's focus. GoPros have always had super deep focus because of their tiny sensors and wide angle lenses, and the same holds true for the Mission 1 Pro. GoPro cites the close focus at 2 feet, but this camera begs to be used in close proximity, which means that if you're filming anything within arm's reach, it'll be out of focus, which is really problematic for vlog content. To get around this, I actually use this set of 3D printed diopters that actually adjust where your infinity focus is. I find that a +2 works best when you have a 2 to 3 foot working distance, and I've used even up to +10 if I'm mounting super close to a foreground element. These work great because I can still use the regular NDs since they just slip on right over the top of the lens. Another neat little software trick is to use the new Cinefocus effect in Resolve 21 to give you a faux depth of field that I think delivers a pretty convincing image. Again, just be prepared to spend a lot more time rendering in post. Overall, I've been pretty happy with this little ripper, and I think GoPro has done a really good job with sticking the landing on this one. But I do think there's definitely room for improvement. I find it really annoying that the USB-C port shares the same door as the battery, so if I want to leave it charging or use any accessories, the battery is just always going to be exposed. I've gotten really accustomed to the Osmo Actions design where the USB-C port has its own dedicated door, and this one just kind of annoys me. Currently, there's no way to view a monitoring LUT or any sort of game assist when shooting GP Log 2, which is annoying because you have no real sense of exposure when you're shooting. So most of the time, I'm just guessing based off of what looks good off the tiny little LCD screen. I do wish the internal mics were a bit better. There are 4 mics that dynamically change depending on where the audio source is coming from, which I think is pretty cool, but I don't think they sound nearly as good as the Osmo Action out of the box. It's a bummer that their wireless mic doesn't natively connect without having to use a receiver like DJI does, so you're stuck having to use a cable with the battery door open, and it just gets really messy. Since this is still such a brand new camera, I haven't really been able to find any third-party cages or support, which is incredibly frustrating. The included point-and-shoot grip isn't great. The bottom isn't flat, so you can't use the 1/4-inch hole with most accessories, and the side that covers the battery door is just prone to falling off. And I already lost mine somewhere on a trail, so I can't even use the grip without having to buy an entirely new cage. It'd also be really great to implement shutter angle out of the box, so that way my motion blur stays consistent as I'm switching frame rates. I know you can go further with GoPro Labs, which is essentially beta firmware that unlocks even more features, but to be totally honest, I'm not interested. If I were a GoPro tech, sure, but if the Mission 1 Pro is truly catering to the professional market, I feel like a lot of these features should just come standard out of the box. This one's rather minor, but your settings lock whenever you start recording, meaning that you'll be unable to change your shutter, your ISO mid-take, which isn't a huge deal, but there are times when I'd like to make an adjustment after I hit rolling. I really wish this front screen were a touchscreen so that I can access and navigate menus while I'm facing the camera. This would be particularly helpful if I had the camera mounted in a really tight space and the back is obscured. Otherwise, you need to pull out your phone and use the app, and sometimes I just don't want to do that. With this camera, I think there's a direct correlation with the amount of effort to your input and the quality of your output. And I find myself spending a lot more time executing shots since I have to manage a lot more accessories and tiny little pieces. But the Mission 1 Pro can also be as mindless as you want it to be. You can ditch all the accessories and just worry about it in post, or spend more time and effort capturing everything in camera. And I think there are merits to both methods. I've seen some early reviews saying that it doesn't really seem any different from previous iterations, but I think that's because you're treating it like a GoPro. If you treat it like a consumer camera, you can expect to get consumer results. And in this day and age, everything is content. And I think this high-powered little action camera can go as far as you want it to.